Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I was the author of Amendment 50, which...
Members, please take your conversations outside the rail.
I was the author of Amendment 50 that has caused this confusion, so I thought if I could maybe help by trying to recenter and refocus things exactly what happened and the intention of the amendment and the resulting bill. If those of you who were here last session recall, when I got up, I described it as a cleanup amendment, which I believe it was and still do, for several reasons. One, the bill kind of originated. I filed a bill in the Elections Committee earlier in the session calling for second-degree felony punishments for voter fraud. That bill was subject to a committee substitute, not by me, but that reduced the penalties down to a Class A misdemeanor. My understanding was that was on the request or recommendation of the Attorney General's office. That made sense to me. I spent my first 5 years of my career in the District Attorney's office. I understand the need to bargain and get witnesses that might not otherwise cooperate by giving them a lower penalty. So it made sense to some extent. So that was one reason to clean up in the amendment, to comply with what that committee had done. The committee passed it out and went to calendars and didn't proceed from there. There were also complaints during the different discussions about the vagueness in the existing code provisions. So the amendment included some additional specificity. There was also complaints about factual necessities. An example of if you helped your aged, disabled grandmother or grandfather, you could be subject to a second-degree felony. So the intent was to try to address things like that. What the focus became is accusations that this amendment that dealt with just one section and did change the penalties, proposed to change the penalties down to a Class A misdemeanor to address those concerns I just mentioned, particularly the Attorney General's request. And also complaints that this undid 40 or 50 years of statutory law. I don't think either one of those are true, and let me expand upon that a little bit. As part of, and that there was a complaint that the matter wasn't debated. Well, Representative Kane filed an amendment to my amendment, providing that it moved to a felony if there was money involved. So any of the things that I had reduced and the proposed reduced to Class A misdemeanor, if there was money involved or attempt to solicit money, it moved up to a felony stage. As part of that, Representative Busey and Representative Kane had a pretty heated exchange on the floor, down to the point where it came down to a record vote, and the record vote approved the amendment to the amendment. Well, as the bill proceeded, went back to the Senate, went to conference, that amendment to the amendment came out. So any discussion that is snuck by, there wasn't full disclosure, wasn't full debate, can't be supported, because there certainly was. But you know, one important, vitally important provision in the amendment that I think has been totally missed and I hope is helpful is that the last paragraph in the amendment provided that action could be brought under this particular code provision or any other code provision or law. The intention being that we wouldn't be locked into one section, and we could address what the Attorney General had requested. We could address the problems with vagueness. We could address the problems with factual differences and maybe minor things shouldn't be a second-degree felony by going with other provisions. And were that so important? And where the argument that this undid 40 or 50 years of law just isn't the case. If you go through even just the election code, there are other provisions. If you've been subjected to or subject to Steve Ministeri's lecture series, he identifies 12 other provisions that carry a felony. And that's what's so important about that catch-all at the end. Earlier in the session, Representative Bonin and Representative Goldman, I think, sponsored House Bill 574. I co-authored it. It provides for secondary felony provisions for more of the voting administration. If you count votes that shouldn't have been counted, don't count votes that should have been counted as a second-degree felony. That type of thing is picked up by that catch-all. So what it does is goes with the facts. Doesn't lock in so that everything's a second-degree felony. If there's a factual determination or a factual issue where maybe there's entitlement to a lesser offense, this enables it. But at the same time, that same provision can be used as a felony, because what we tried to do in that amendment is intentionally provide that everything that was in that section that we lowered to a Class A misdemeanor can be picked up elsewhere in the code as a felony if the facts support that. So I kind of think it comes down to, you know, we should be here to provide and enact good policy. And too often we get in a conflict or contrast between policy and politics. And I just try to recenter this back to not just focus on this one section, but the totality of the amendment, the totality of what remains in the election code that, as I've described before, I think it satisfies and provides the best of both worlds. With that, I hope that's been helpful. And I just, I understand as well as anyone, maybe more so, the importance of voter integrity and our election integrity. It goes to the heart of our democracy. So if you think the better policy is that these things should be a second-degree felony, I encourage you to vote for the bill. On the other hand, if you think that the better policy is to provide the provisions I think we intended in the amendment, vote that way. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.